Okay, welcome this evening's program of Kevin Brockmeier with Carmen Maria Machado. It's so wonderful to see many familiar names and new names. Yes, and so we are thrilled to have these authors here. I'm going to start out just with a little spiel about Blue Stoop. So Blue Stoop is a community-based organization here in Philadelphia, and we support writers and readers from all walks of life. We offer rigorous craft classes, as well as a event series of which this event is a part, pairing nationally touring writers like Kevin Brockmeier in conversation with local authors like Carmen Maria Machado. So I just want to plug that in 2 weeks, we have Chris Malcolm Belk with Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, which will be wonderful on June 15th. Also, subscribe and check us out at bluestoop.org for news and updates about our weekly Wednesdays on the Stoop program, which is a weekly free Zoom hour of creativity, chaired by one of our authors or community members who want to offer something in terms of writing or craft or their reading practice for free to the community. So those are always available for folks. But turning to tonight's program, it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Brockmeier and Carmen Maria Machado. So I'll introduce Kevin, I'll introduce Carmen. They'll chat for 20-ish minutes. There'll also be some moments of readings from Kevin, some chatting, some readings. It will be very organic and wonderful. At any point, if you have a question for Kevin or for Carmen, please feel free to put it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. All right, so very pleased to welcome Kevin Brockmeier, who's the author of the memoir, A Few Seconds of Radiant Film Strip, the novels, The Illumination, The Brief History of the Dead, and The Truth About Celia, and of course, the story collections, The Ghost Variations, which we're celebrating tonight, as well as Things That Fall from the Sky and The View from the Seventh Layer. Also, novels for children called City of Names and Grooves, A Kind of Mystery. His work has been translated into 17 languages. He teaches frequently at the Iowa Writers Workshop and lives in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he was raised. And we're also welcoming Carmen Maria Machado, pal, Blue Stoop board member extraordinaire, neighbor, who is the author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House and the award-winning story collection Her Body and Other Parties, which has been a finalist for the National Book Award, No Big Deal, winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, Lambda Literary Award, Lesbian Fiction, the Brooklyn Public Library Literature Prize, Shirley Jackson Award, and so many others, including the National Critics Circle John Leonard Prize. So we're pleased to welcome both of these wonderful authors who are pals, I understand it as well. So welcome, Kevin and Carmen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to do a weird thing where I'm also going to introduce Kevin because I thought I was doing it. And I will skip over the bio that Emma just read, but I did want to just briefly read something about Kevin that I wrote for y'all. The first thing I ever read of Kevin Brockmeier's was a short story in an anthology of adapted fairy tales. The story was called A Day in the Life of Half of Rumpelstiltskin and told the story of, well, a day in the life of Rumpelstiltskin, but after the end of the original story, when he stamped his foot and tore himself in half. I was so young back then. My work was a twinkle in no one's eye. I was completely taken with this story, which described the ordinary day of an ordinary man who wants something he cannot have, except that he's neatly lopped in two. He wakes up, he showers, carefully drying his organs and his bones. He goes to work. He gets a letter from his missing half, appropriately written in Mad Lib's form. But the moment that really undid me, the moment that cemented Kevin in my mind forever, is the scene in which half of Rumpelstiltskin goes to the grocery store and sees a baby in a shopping cart. Kevin writes, he would have never imagined, not for a heartbeat, that children were so easily come by. Had he known you could buy them at the supermarket, his life might not have become the mess it is today. The story goes on after that, but I wouldn't find out the rest until a while later. I was so undone by those sentences, I had to put the story down. I can't think of a better way to introduce you to Kevin Brockmeier, how every one of his stories, novels, and collections is singular, genre-defying, indescribably beautiful, a breathtaking marriage of high-concept formal play that shouldn't work, but does, all grounded in devastating emotional truths and sharp observations and a keen eye for the pleasures of everyday life. And Emma has just read all of Kevin's bona fides, but I did want to say that Kevin is also a very gifted teacher of writing and in fact was my teacher. And it was one of the greatest privileges of my education to be his student. So everybody please welcome Kevin to Blue Stew.
Thank you very much, Carmen. That was a kind introduction. We can talk later, maybe during this hour or another time, about a day in the life of half of Rumpelstiltskin.
I would love to.
It's the earliest of my written stories that's seen print. I was a senior in college when I wrote that one. If thanks to Blue Stew for hosting me, and thank you to all of you for attending this event. Carmen, you're very gracious with your introduction and to agree to participate in this with me. So Emma told you a little bit about how the hour is going to unfold. I'm going to read a couple stories from the book, and then we'll chat for a while. And then I will read a couple more stories that I've not yet chosen, that I'll come to by random means. Then we'll chat some more, and then I'll close the hour off with one last story. So the latest book is called The Ghost Variations, 100 Stories. And it's exactly that. It's 100 very short stories, all of which address themselves to the idea of ghosts or ghostliness. Some of them, most of them very directly, but some of them more passingly or tangentially. The two that I want to begin with represent kind of the polarities of the book. The first will be the book in one of its brighter shades, and the second, the book in one of its darker shades. Again, these are all very short. So the first one, I borrowed its title from the title of an earlier story of mine. It's number 20 in the book, and it's called Things That Fall from the Sky. Following the rain of ghosts, the earth smelled of moss and black pepper, and buildings appeared to waver at their boundaries. But then the sun came out, drying the puddles and lifting the dimpling marks from the soil, and the world seemed like itself again, untransformed. For a few weeks, the city maintained its routines. The school bells rang at 9 and 4. The cars stacked up at the stoplights. On Saturdays, the produce market busied itself by the river. It was easy to forget that morning when, without so much as a thunder crack, the air had filled with the spinning forms of a million dead spirits. Somehow no one heard the change say, "I'm coming." Spring was beginning to turn to summer when the first trees yielded their crop of ghost fruit. All at once there they were, a sea of soft-specked blue globes that bobbed from the tips of the branches, nearly irresistible to pick, and once picked, to bite into. When pierced, the skin produced a tiny leap of smoke. The flesh was not smoky to the tongue, though, but flossy and succulent. Raw, it tasted like an oddly nectary cucumber. Baked, not like grapes per se, but like the grape additive in sodas and lollipops. Delicious. The seeds were as hard as BBs and had to be enucleated from a milky green cleft in the center. But otherwise, the fruit seemed to satisfy the exact hunger it generated, to satisfy it perfectly. Soon after you ate one, though, it would happen. A door would swing open inside you, and through it would come drifting the specter of another person. To have a second identity nestling alongside your own, clouding around inside you and making your fingertips tingle, was invigorating, but also disconcerting. Homebodies who had never traveled farther than the state park surprised themselves by talking about the crowded subways of Tokyo or the cave tombs of Sulawesi. Children complained that their spouses didn't love them anymore. A cashier at the ballpark recited a poem she insisted she had written in a language she said she didn't recognize. These additional personalities rarely lasted longer than a day or two, but everyone, to the last man and woman, was sorry to see theirs go. A life felt so much bigger with two sets of memories inside it. By November, most of the harvest had been consumed, most of the ghosts digested. By January, there was hardly anybody who had not become resigned to possessing one and only one spirit. But by March, it was discovered that the BBs had taken root in the soil. By summer, at the edges of certain fields, they were growing into dainty saplings. And by September, the first hard blue kernels could be seen, budding between their leaves. From then on, in at least this one city, people lived out their days with a sense of expansiveness and reverent mystery, nourished by this world and also by some other. The second one I'd like to read, again, is the book in one of its darker modes. A writer, former student of mine, Anjali Sakdeva, told me that this was the story in the book that she found the most disturbing. It's number 41, and it's called Action. That famous director, standing at the edge of the railway concourse, is determined to make a movie that is, as they say, literally unwatchable. 71, and garlanded with more honorary doctorates and lifetime achievement awards than he knows what to do with. He again feels like the wild-haired punk filmmaker of his enfant terrible days, whose work Cineforum so memorably dubbed the wreck not only of the art world, but of art and of the world. Once again, he has a purpose. The movie he is preparing to film will, he believes, constitute his single greatest achievement. If that is, it is, as he hopes, literally unwatchable. By literally unwatchable, he does not mean a movie that is bad or distasteful, or at least not per se, not unwatchable for those reasons. Nor does he mean a movie that is incompetent or maladroit. In fact, the very opposite. No, the movie he intends to make will be unwatchable in the strictest possible sense of the term, because it genuinely cannot be seen. Now, there are several ways in which a movie that cannot be seen might be said to be unseeable. One, it might not exist, or might exist only notionally, as an idea or a thought experiment, rather than a series of moving images. But the famous director considers such subterfuge beneath him. Two, it might be shot, processed, or shown in such a way as to prevent its own observation. For example, using film that records only ultraviolet or infrared light, or projected onto a small screen several miles distant, or a high screen several miles in the air. The famous director regards these options as one-offs, art installations, and not the kind of honorable proletarian filmmaking to which he has always aspired. Three, it might be unwatchable not because the medium itself forbids observation, but because no one remains to do the observing. Imagine, for instance, a movie documenting the release of a toxin that, over the course of 6 or 7 weeks, while the footage is in post-production, will cause the swift and cascading annihilation of all life on Earth. Theoretically, the only gamble in such a case would be the classical one. That is, whether people are transfigured into souls, ghosts, upon dying, and therefore at least ostensibly capable of watching a movie, or whether they are discharged into the blackness of oblivion. The famous director is, as it happens, in possession of just such a toxin. He stands at the edge of the busy concourse, beneath the boom mic and the tungstens, and mops the sweat from his brow. The camera is rolling. He pries the top off a capped glass vial. It produces the tiny, almost humorous champagne bottle sound that children make when they pop their fingers from their mouths. In no more than 7 weeks, if he has gambled correctly, the movie the famous director is shooting will be ready for viewing and yet unwatchable. The perfect capstone to his long and innovative career. All right, so that's 2% of the book. 100 stories, those are 2 of them. And now Carmen and I are just going to spend a while chatting before I turn to another couple stories with the assistance of the audience. So Carmen, I'm happy to talk about anything you might be curious to talk about.
Yeah, well, I think, oh, sorry, I'm still like reeling from that second story. I also find that story incredibly disturbing.
Yeah.
It's great.
Thank you.
One of the sort of, I think, defining and interesting things about this book is the way that ghosts are sort of defined, or ghostliness is defined very loosely. And even the epigraphs of the book, you talk about tell me what you see vanishing and I will tell you who you are. And it's hard to successfully imagine an object that does not look like a ghost. So this idea that like ghostliness can be sort of anything.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you about your relationship with ghosts and ghost stories, and this idea that a ghost sort of is not necessarily like literal, you know, the idea of like a dead person, but like the ghostliness and hauntings are sort of more, I guess, nebulous or looser than that. So I just wanted to talk to you about like that idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the advantages of viewing ghosts so broadly is that it permitted me to write stories in 100 different keys. So when I was thinking about what I knew about this book before I knew anything else was that it would be 100 stories that were all roughly the same length. I didn't know anything else about it, just the form. Very soon after that, I decided that I would orient all of those stories around ghosts or ghostliness in one way or another. And part of that is just a long-standing fascination I have with fantasizing about the afterlife. My best known earlier book is a novel called The Brief History of the Dead, which takes place, at least in part, in an afterlife that's populated by the dead but not yet forgotten. So these have always seemed spaces to me that were ripe for storytelling. In addition to that, though, I have certain ideas. First of all, I've always taken pleasure in ghost stories, although I was kind of a cowardly kid in some ways. So, I mean, if anything was too frightening to me, I didn't want to expose myself to it. Because I would cry and throw up. The first horror movie I ever saw, I was in, I think, 3rd grade and in Cub Scouts, and our den mother decided to show us The Shining. And I was already frightened by axe murderers. Like, I had a thing about axe murderers. So it did not sit well with me, which meant that I avoided kind of stories of that type for the most part while I was growing up. But it also kind of activated their substance for me, like in ways that made it very potent. So, I mean, I have this notion that like one of the most important features of experience and what it's like to be alive is this like never-ending sensation that there's part of you that's addressing itself to being. And at the same time, there's part of you that's always addressing itself to non-being. And books are almost never about this. And yet I think fiction is almost never about this. And yet it seems so central to me, to what it feels like to be alive. And it seems to me that if you're writing a book of ghost stories, and although it might not have been obvious from at least the second of those stories, many of these stories are about ghosts in their more traditional guise. If you're writing about ghosts, it can be another way of writing about human beings as they direct themselves toward non-being. Part of ourselves is material and physical. And then part of ourselves, I think, or at least part of how we think about ourselves is immaterial or fantastic. And I was hoping that this was a book that would allow me to address itself to both of those sides of human experience simultaneously. The physical side of our experience, which is all about being, and the non-physical side of our experience, which is all about non-being. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I was curious about. But I was also interested in how I might write certain stories that were not about the human experience whatsoever. It's easy to talk about fiction as if it's at its best, the more human it is. And there's a reason to think that way, because fiction is very good, better, I think, than any other art form at revealing what it's like to occupy somebody else's consciousness and actually exist inside some other human being. But I don't know that human beings are actually the most interesting thing that's going on in the world. And I've often thought that it would be exciting if there were ways to write fiction that wasn't oriented around humanity, that was oriented around other things altogether. It's difficult to figure out how to write stories of that type, but it seemed to me that this was a book that would allow me to do that. First of all, because it's in part about ghosts, and second of all, because there are 100 different self-contained stories here. So I could pursue these other impulses if I was interested in pursuing them.
I feel like that's a thing that a story collection permits you to do, is like within one book, like have these sort of shifting modes of engagement. I mean, I guess you could do that in a novel as well, I suppose. And you do that in A Brief History of the Dead, but I do feel like there's something really interesting about being able to like move from like mode to mode, because you just have this like inherently flexible form that you're working with. Well, now that, I mean, it's funny because you're talking about humanity and how you're interested in like writing away from sort of humanity. And it makes me think about how now they're basically telling us that aliens probably exist, that like UFOs have been seen, and that like maybe aliens are real. And maybe another sort of mode of thinking, it's like a living being that is not human.
It could be an interesting summer. Like, we'll
right?
see what announcements we're given.
And this actually sort of like takes me into one of my favorite stories in this book, which is the one about the elephants.
Okay.
Which I don't know if you want to explain it or I should explain it for the folks who haven't read it. But there's a story in here in which a scientist is plays a recording for some elephants. It's a beautiful story. I'm gonna just not do it justice, but and he plays a recording of an elephant matriarch who's long dead, and the elephants are like very distraught by like the sound, like basically like the sound of a ghost that they don't understand.
Yeah.
And the end of the story suggests that it's the beginning of this like mythology for the elephants, that like they then sort of mark that as a day when they like heard the voice of a dead ancestor like speaking to them. And that is a story which is sort of centering this idea of like, how would an animal perceive a ghost, which I feel like is such an interesting pivot on that idea.
Thank you. I'm very interested in non-human consciousness. If you visit my website, which is kevinbrockmeier.com, I've got a page dedicated to lists. And I'm up to list, as of today, list number 327, which is, that last one is a list of 10 novels about that kind of make an art form out of palavering, which is, just chit chat, basically. But there's a list that I like very much on that page, which is 50 books that adopt animals as their protagonists, or as prominent characters, or as point of view characters. And it's 50 books arranged alphabetically by animal. Like it's a pleasure of mine, books like that. One of the best books I've read this year is a Russian novel called Faithful Ruslan. Let's see, the author's name is Georgy Vladimov. And it's about a dog who guarded a prison camp. And it's one of the most moving and effective works of kind of animal transposition that I've ever read on the page. You really feel like you're occupying the experience of this dog. It's a beautifully accomplished book. So there are a fair number of stories in this book which do that kind of work, which try to invest themselves in the minds of other creatures other than human beings.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about this thing that you were talking about being a frightened child, because I am also, I mean, I never threw up, but I was also like a deeply anxious child who like moved toward horror and moved toward fear and ghosts and monsters in these like really intense ways, much to the consternation of my parents, who were like, you're not sleeping at night, you really need to stop, like reading scary books and watching scary movies. And I remember once talking to somebody about this, and they said, oh, you just like work that like altered your temperature. Like you found pleasure in like being like the potency of like being sort of like not sexually aroused, but aroused and like provoked. And there's something like, even though it made you afraid, it also like drew something out of you that you found really interesting that you kept kind of returning to. Do you feel like that's part of your process, or like what is it that sort of brings you, I guess, closer to fear and closer to darkness, like what in terms of your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do find myself turning toward the things that I respond to the most intimately. And one of the intimacies of my experience is the things that frighten me or bring me pain. And it's not that all of my books have been oriented around those feelings, but some of them definitely have. Like there's also, you know, you're talking about being activated by horror when you were a child, but I was also activated by books that I thought were telling truths about my life that I didn't know anybody else was aware of. For instance, this is, I'm sure you've read this book, Super Fudge by Judy Blume. Yeah. So, I mean, she was very popular when I was a kid. And I liked those books a lot. And I remember reading that one in particular. And there was a scene where Peter, who is the narrator of the book, and it was, I think, in 5th grade by the time like that book was taking place, was in line to see a movie behind a girl that he had a crush on. And the wind was blowing and it blew her hair back into his face. And he didn't want to move because he liked the sensation of having her hair blowing over his features. But he didn't want to bring her attention to it because if he did, it would stop. And I remember reading that and thinking, like that sounds just like me, you know, but I would never have guessed that anybody was aware that that was taking place inside my head. You know, fear was also something like that, like, you know, something that was taking place in my head. And, you know, it was satisfying in some ways to see it on the page. But it was, you know, I wasn't one of those kids who was reading Stephen King at age 11. Like, I was reading Stephen King at age 17. You know, it took me a while before I felt comfortable really exposing myself to those feelings. They seemed actually dangerous to me when I was little.
I mean, I feel like that the thing you described from Super Fudge, I feel like is also that in a way that is that this question of like writing toward humanity, where it's like identification of like a human desire. I mean, I feel like you write so beautifully about desire and pleasure. Like, I feel like that's very like central to a lot of, I mean, I've never forgotten, like there's some image in, I can't remember, it's one of your novels where like this woman like pushes her toes against like a chair in a lawn.
That is in the ceiling. It's in the first page of the ceiling.
Oh my God. And it's such a like vivid and specific image. And I feel like my experience as a reader is like when I read an image that feels so, there is this sense of like, it's like hits your marrow. You're like, oh, that feels really real and really like concrete and like so specific that it's not like there's no way that was invented. That's like an observation that somebody made, but also I didn't know anyone else had ever made that observation before.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like for me, that's also like a pleasure in reading, is like, actually, it's like this idea of like my ghost touches your ghost. It's like this idea that like two people's consciousnesses have like tapped each other in this moment of this like clear observation.
Yeah, I mean, most of my favorite books offer that experience. Not all of them, like, you know, some of them do very unusual things that have nothing to do with that experience, but a lot of them feel to me as if they were kind of pressed into being out of the author's willingness to give away what was most intimate to him or herself. If you read Turtle Diary by Russell Hoban, it's a beautiful book published in, I think, the very late 70s. I came to it more recently. It's probably the best novel I've read in the past, say, decade. I found it very moving in exactly that way. It felt like it just knew certain secrets about my life that were profound and that I didn't realize anybody else was aware of. When you read certain books, you just feel like you're not alone in the world, you know? You're not the only one who understands what it feels like to be a human being. And that was one of those books for me.
I guess I want to talk a little bit about just the of the collection of stories. I mean, this is an interesting book because it's like not quite a linked collection, but not quite like a traditional short story collection. But obviously you're a writer who's like, even you've written children or books for young people, you've written novels, you've written short story collections. And I was just sort of wondering, I guess, your sort of feelings about the short story form, like what it has to offer. I mean, I feel like it's such a weird thing to talk about because I feel like a lot of writers get so nervous about short stories because they're such a weird, like, in terms of like marketing and money and all that stuff, like it's a very weird sort of shape. But as a short story writer myself, like I love the form so much. And I guess, you know, why short stories, like what pleasures do they offer you? You know, why do you keep returning to them?
Yeah, well, this book in particular, I ended up writing largely because I was reading and enjoying so much flash fiction. And I mean, I had written many short stories, but I had never written stories that were that short. And yet as a reader, I found myself being energized by them. And like, I think of my books as being in conversation with other books often. And that was very much the case with this. I wanted to see if I could write a book that adopted that form. And it was a brand new form for me. I didn't really know how to do it. I had to teach myself how to do it while I was writing this book. And because the stories operate very differently, I had to teach myself how to do it 100 times over. I read an interview with a writer named Peter Bichsel, Bichsel, I think it's spelled. He's a Swedish writer, I think Swedish, barely translated into English. But he said something that I thought was funny about how, you know, you can divide writers into kind of marathon runners and sprinters. And typically you would think of the marathon runner as being well suited to the novel, and the sprinter as being well suited to the short story. And he said that what he actually is, and I think it's the same thing I am, he said that when he writes short stories, he's not actually a sprinter. He's a marathon runner working over a very short distance. And that's not an easy thing to do, but that's how it felt to me when I was writing this book as well. Just over and over again, I was running these 100 little tiny marathons. You know, and they weren't easy to figure out how to complete. Although in a handful of cases, because they were so very short, like either in manuscript, they were no longer than 1 page, no shorter than 2/3 of a page. In the published book, they're all roughly 2 pages long. Because they were so short, very occasionally, I was able to kind of conceive of them in a burst, like if not a burst of sentences, at least kind of the entire architecture or motion of the story. I would be able to have it in my mind before I began writing. At least, you know, 3 or 4 times in the book, I did that. And that was very pleasurable and unusual for me because usually I discover a lot as I'm writing. If it's okay, let me read a couple more stories. So when I'm writing a book, I often have a totem object of some kind that I keep on my desk from the very beginning to the very end of the process. And in the case of this book, it was this little thing here. This is a 100-sided die. It's called a zakihedron. And it's a hollowed out die with kind of beans or beads in the center, which keeps it from just rolling endlessly like a golf ball, with 100 different facets on it. And my idea when I was working on the book was that when I read from it, I could roll this die, figure out which number it gave me, and just read the story that was attached to that number. So I want to try to do that. All right. Story number 6. And this is, have I read it before? I have read this one before. This is called A Long Chain of Yesterdays. Not for the first time, or even the 100th, the bank president stands at his office window at 6:03 on the evening of Tuesday, March 3rd, 1987. 2 birds square off on the other side of the glass, bickering over what looks like a raisin. The sky is as pink as cupcake frosting. Far below him, a delivery truck triggers its horn, an agitated sound that the distance transforms into an adorable beep. The scene is so calming, so toy-like, that originally, for one bare minute, smack in the middle of his life, It suffused the bank president with a sense of inexplicable peace, a bone-deep certainty that everything would be all right. But after the 8th repetition, or the 19th, he noticed that at this time of day, on this date, the horn always beeps adorably. The birds always nip at the raisin. The sky is always a cupcake pink. Thus, the bank president feels overcome, despite the beauty and charm of it all, by the tedium, the invariability. He knows that his ennui is not March the 3rd, 1987 at 6:03's fault, not specifically. Every other moment is just as static. Take 11:24 on the morning of Friday, July the 26th, 1940. It is his older sister's 8th birthday. He is drinking lemonade in the backyard. His elbows are reddening against the picnic table, and a coiled paper party horn crimps to the left as he blows through it. Or 4:36 a.m. on Wednesday, December 6th, 1972. He is watching the color bars on a hotel TV and crunching the ice from a gin and tonic. Idly, he plucks at the hangnail on his thumb, then strips it loose with his front teeth. The cold of the ice on his lips deadens the sting. Or 3 in the afternoon on Thursday, August 10th, 2006. He is trekking through the rough after a golf ball when his heart makes a fist around itself. Then he is lying on his back beneath a catalpa tree with a V-shaped trunk. The leaves vary their patterns of lighter and darker green as the wind bats them around in the sunlight. He remembers his pleasure upon discovering after his heart stopped that as a ghost, he could revisit any moment of his life as many times as he wanted to. Any minute, though, no matter how extraordinary, will harden into its form if it happens the same way often enough, he soon discovered. Eventually, the bank president worries, he will forget that he is a ghost, that this endless series of repetitions is not his life. Will forget how it felt when things could still happen for the first time. For now, though, he stands once more at his office window. It is 6:03 on the evening of Tuesday, March the 3rd, 1987. Despite the pinkness of the sky, the streetlights have already been kindled. Long rows of dots that, for reasons he does not understand, seem to grow brighter the farther away they are. The other method that I was thinking I would use when I published this book to kind of land on random stories is to kind of, I presume this would be happening in person when I was writing the book, but instead it'll be happening by chat. So I thought I would just ask the attendees if somebody wanted just to toss out a number to me between 1 and 100, and I would read whatever stories attached to that number and then kind of move on to more questions. Number 39 from Wilbert Turner III. Thank you. Let me shut the chat box. 39, let's see what it is. All right, this is one I've never read before. It's There Are People, They Had Lives, which was at one point the title of the book when I was trying to figure out what to call it. Because the first afterlife had become too crowded, they built another. A team of laborers and engineers was dispatched to the marshes that lay beyond the celestial border to siphon the mud from the bogs, fill in the bottomlands, and stitch the earth up with green grass and brown sod. From the remaining marsh water, they created crystal clear lakes with beds of white shingle. In no time at all, sightly new neighborhoods of houses, parks, and tennis courts were assembled on the shores. As a finishing touch, a pedestrian bridge, curved like a bass clef, was erected over the largest of the reservoirs. The mosquitoes still presented a problem, so the whole area was blanketed with insecticide, after which the problem was the ghosts of the mosquitoes, legions of wailing specks needling around on pure dumb instinct. But as the chief engineer pointed out, even the finest developments had their headaches. And if phantom mosquitoes were the worst of theirs, they could count the project a transcendent success. The team packed up its equipment and returned to the main office. The afterlife job, they reported, was finished, under budget and ahead of schedule. All it lacked were its residents, and such a dilemma was hardly a dilemma at all, since the living, say what you would about them, kept dying. More ghosts arrived by the day, and from then on, nearly all of them were assigned to the second afterlife, with its clusters of decorative bulrushes, its plazas paved with red and yellow bricks, and its smart new houses that smelled of paint and sawdust. In addition, to alleviate the congestion, it was decided that the population of the original afterlife would be reduced by roughly 4%. A lottery was conducted to select the several billion requisite immigrants from the first afterlife to the second. Some of the administrators worried that this would leave people thinking of themselves as either winners or losers, that those of them whose names were called would feel cheated of their rightful homes, or conversely, that those of them whose names were not called would feel cheated of some grand adventure. Yet no one foresaw what has actually happened, which is that everyone feels cheated now, everyone like a loser. In all but the most trivial ways, the two afterlives are exactly the same. The trees bud, the breezes blow. There are people, they had lives. So perhaps it is just human nature that the ghosts in the first afterlife spend their time feeling neglected, obsolete, as if the world has outdistanced them, while the ghosts in the second spend their time swatting at insects that whine and that buzz, but that cannot feed on them, no matter how hard they try. So that's two more stories, which means that you've now heard 4% of the book. And we have time for more conversation and questions from either Carmen or the audience.
Yeah, we've got some questions from the audience. So Annika asks, do you have a favorite story out of this book?
It's very hard to select a single favorite story because there are 100 of them. And, I haven't had the chance to read all of them in public settings yet, but sometimes I do. And I think, that one works pretty well. Like I had, I didn't quite realize that it's actually cohesive. It's been a pleasure to read from the book because not to pat myself on the back, but there are times when you feel demoralized and, you wonder, as hard as you worked on a book, whether it's actually effective or will speak to anybody. Something about reading these stories out loud has made them feel alive to me in a way that I had forgotten they were. Well, after all the work of the book was finished. That said, the story Carmen mentioned, Elephants, I think is one of my favorites in the book. There's a story called Knees that is another one of my favorites. The final story in the book is also one of my favorites. It's called The Most Terrifying Ghost Story Ever Written. And the story itself is not actually very frightening. It's kind of more academic, but it operates in a Borgesian mode that I kind of find pleasurable.
I also love that story.
And there are lots of others in the book, but those are three that leap to mind.
And Wilbert, the person who gave you number 39, Wilbert Turner III, says, when writing short fiction, it can be difficult to focus the story's gaze. How do you focus the concerns and themes of the stories, especially during the early drafts?
Okay, well, these stories in particular were all very, very short. So they were not kind of setting out in search of their material. They were setting out in search of how to express that material and what sequence of sentences would best bring it into being. But the conceits of each story were always in place before I began writing. And sometimes the feeling tones of the story as well. I knew whether I wanted them to be comic or frightening or disturbing or sad or sentimental. The story that I read after I rolled the die, for instance, that one I knew was about a life as a form of endless repetition. And what interested me about it was this line that comes near the end. Eventually, the bank president worries he will forget that he is a ghost, that this endless series of repetitions is not his life. Will forget how it felt when things could still happen for the first time. So that story came into being because I was interested in thinking about what the difference is between, like, if death is also a form of being, what's the difference between that form of being and the form of being that is life? And I thought, just as a hypothesis, what if the difference is that life is when things happen for the first time and death is when they happen in repetition? And how would that feel like if you were experiencing or ultimately enduring a death like that? So that was what brought that story into being. But there were others that kind of came into being through other principles. Occasionally, when I was struggling for material, I borrowed titles from my earlier stories. So my first two collections are called Things That Fall from the Sky and The View from the Seventh Layer. And at one point, I took the titles of all the stories in both of those books, 24 of them all together, and put them in invisible brackets at the top of 24 different pages, just to see what stories they would generate. And sometimes those stories are in conversation with the stories from my earlier books. And sometimes I just allowed the titles to offer something up. So Carmen, you mentioned A Day in the Life of Half of Rumpelstiltskin. The story in this book that's inspired by that one is called Bilateral Symmetry. And it's about a character that's a phrase that's in Half of Rumpelstiltskin. And the ghost story that's borrowed from that phrase is about a character who dies twice in the same instant and therefore becomes two separate ghosts, and how those ghosts go about conducting their afterlives. So in the case of this book, the stories were very much conceit driven, which is not to say that I wanted the conceits to be the most important things about them, although sometimes I did. But that there was always something at the heart of them, like basically an idea that I thought I could, leap onto as though it were a piece of playground equipment, and see what kind of fun I could have with it. Even though not all of the stories, they're not all joyful in their emotional tones. I think they all arose in one way or another out of a sense of play. And that feeling is very much at the heart of the book.
Michael asks, how did you get comfortable sharing so much of yourself or inner thoughts or your secrets in your work?
I wouldn't say that every story I've written has been an effort to take something that was precious to me and to give it away. But I think most of the stories I've written that are most meaningful to other readers have been born out of that impulse to take what was most important to me and to give it away. I think when you're writing about the things that are truly intimate to you, it can produce the best stories, because it's a kind of dare that you're posing to yourself to write about the things that matter the most to you without screwing them up. You feel that, if you're writing about something that means the world to you, you've got to figure out how to do justice to it. And that's difficult. And it can seem intimidating. But it also gives a story a reason to exist. And it requires you to do your best by the material. So, I just think that that's, there are all sorts of ways to be brave on the page, but there's a certain form of human bravery. It's aesthetic in some ways, but really it's personal. It's just saying, this is what actually means the most to me. Not what I pretend means the most to me, not what I think should mean the most to me, but what I actually care the most about. And this is my attempt to make use of it on the page, and give it to you. And the books that have meant the most to me as a reader often seem to me to be born out of that same impulse.
Annika asks, do you have a specific author or a few that you would say inspired you to become a writer?
Yes. So again, please visit my webpage and kind of look at that list. There are so many of them on there, and like many of them are dedicated to my favorite writers. I'll mention, I could talk endlessly about my favorite writers and the books that I've read this year that I've loved the best. I've got a list on that page of my favorite books by year of my life, beginning at age 1 and adding up to 48. Like I'm now 48. But I'll talk about 2 of them very quickly. My favorite writer when I was a kid, when I was, say, age 10, who is still one of my favorite writers today, is Daniel Pinkwater. My favorite of his books is Alan Mendelsohn, The Boy from Mars, which is still a book I adore. And I remember checking it out from my school library when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, and just feeling that something about the book operated the way the inside of my own head worked. And that, you know, there was just, I was inside that book. It was such a pleasure to me to read it and to have that sensation. And it was exciting to me in a way that very few other books had been exciting up to that point, or at least exciting in different ways. So he's a writer who was important to me and has remained important to me. And the children's books I've written are in some ways in conversation with the kind of books he writes. My number one guy as like an adult writer, I've got a photograph right here that I keep by my desk. This was a gift from a friend of mine. This is Italo Calvino and Jorge Luis Borges having a conversation over coffee. And I love them both. And Calvino in particular has been very, very important to me. The Baron in the Trees and Invisible Cities and Cosmocomics are all books that I treasure. And the Ghost Variations in particular is probably in some ways, and it's in conversation with a lot of books, but in some ways in conversation with Invisible Cities, which works as a cohesive whole, but is also a sequence of very, very short, independently devised stories that are all inspired by fantasies of one kind or another. And you could say the same thing about the Ghost Variations.
Sorry, your book just
Something frightened you.
I did have the book fell off my desk. Did you want to close this out with one last story?
Yes, I'd love to. All right. So the last story I want to read, this is another one I've never read before. I'm hoping that eventually I'll have read all 100 stories.
Are you keeping track, like in the corner of the pages, or how do you know which ones you've read? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So this is number 77, and it's called Too Late. His wife was tender-hearted, idealistic, guileless, nurturing, and intuitive, but also quick to take injury from simple accidents of phrasing. He himself was simultaneously talkative and bumbling, the kind of man who said 3 wrong things on his way to every right one, punting figures of speech around like soccer balls. Though he tried to be gentle toward her, and she tried to be charitable toward him, it couldn't last and didn't. His second wife was more ambitious than he was, and also more fastidious. But at 26, she was still a virgin. She had begun to feel as if her virginity had metastasized, like a cancer. And so, in desperation, she had married him, admitting only after their honeymoon was over that he was the wrong man. His third wife was an amateur actor and a devout Christian. She mistook his irreverence for an elaborate act of prolonged theater and was incensed when she realized how extravagantly she had misunderstood him. His fourth wife could not stop imagining all the alternate paths her life might have followed. What if she had accepted that job overseas, kept that child, married someone else? His fifth wife was still infatuated with her prior husband, her third, who himself, it developed, was also still infatuated with her. His sixth wife was a perfectionist, irritated not so much by his defects as by his failure to notice hers. His seventh wife was too naive for him, his 8th too adventurous. Not until his 9th wife left him for her chiropractor was he able to diagnose his problem. He was one of love's wishful thinkers, blown this way and that by his faith in romance, and thus always vulnerable to the next woman, the next wife. He would meet someone at a lecture or a party, feel a canyony sensation of intimacy and potential, and before he knew it, bam, another marriage. His 10th wife objected to his politics, too wishy-washy. His 11th objected to his silences, too damning. He was preparing to wed his 12th wife when he died. Some 6 months later, he found himself on the other side of a Ouija board, speaking with a woman so desperate for evidence of the spirit world that her stomach kept producing sound effects, the kind of noises a bear might make, or two balloons rubbing together. "I'm sorry," she apologized, and "oh dear, forgive me." The planchette traced out his answers. Forgiven, forgiven. METOO, me too. ALONE, alone. Suddenly, by instinct, he knew that he should marry her, knew that, given the chance, this love was the one that would actually persist. But before he could ask the question, she moved the planchette to goodbye, and he faded away somewhere. Because in death, as in life, when it comes to questions of the heart, you came just in time always means you came too late. All right, so that's 5 stories from the book, which means 5% of the total. Thank you, Carmen, so much for talking with me and introducing me. Thank you to Emma and Blue Stoop for hosting me. And thank you for everybody who attended for showing up at this event. I hope you'll buy the book if you haven't already. And particularly, I hope you'll buy it and Carmen's book as well. Either of Carmen's books through Blue Stoop. And there should be links in the Q&A or in the chat box that'll allow you to do that. So Emma, let me hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the plug. Yes, please do. We get just some lovely pennies out of the impressive collection that Kevin shared with us tonight. So yes, if you would purchase Carmen and Kevin's book, we always appreciate it, from bookshop.org. And I put the link in the chat, indeed, and also the link to our upcoming events. Again, Chris Malcolm Buck with Alex Marzano-Lesnevich on June 15th. Very exciting. Thank you so much, Carmen, Kevin. Brava. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. And thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you to Annika for coming from Europe as well.
Wow. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.